Now we see an example of dense irregular connective tissue. Irregular meaning that in this case, the collagen proteins are running at all kinds of different angles. They're not all running in the same direction like they would be in the dense regular connective tissue, but in this case they're running at different directions. And again, this is the type of tissue we would find in our deep dermis, our dermis, this lower, thicker layer of skin. And of course, the advantage of this is the fact that because we have fibers running in different directions, we're more pliable, we have more ability to contort the tissue in different directions without necessarily damaging it. The weakness is it's not as strong because it's not all going in one direction, but it is more pliable. Here we see elastic tissue again. In this case, this is a dense, regular connective tissue. And again, the fibers are densely packed. They're regular because they're all running in one direction. In this case, again, we see our fibroblasts, our living cells that produce these fibers. Here we have our elastic fibers, which are proteins. And the elastic fibers tend to have a little more flexibility to them, but they are all running in one direction. So notice in this case what we're actually looking at are ligaments. And in ligaments, these are the tissues that connect bone to bone. And so we see even in the picture, we see the ligaments connecting different portions of the vertebrae to hold them in place. Okay, our next tissue, which is a connective tissue, is actually blood. Now, blood falls under our definition because it has specialized cells. Here we see the different specialized cells being our erythrocytes, a red blood cell whose main job is to carry oxygen, and it also carries some carbon dioxide out of towards the lungs to get rid of. But the main job is it carries oxygen from the lungs to the cells. We see that we have white blood cells that their main job is immunity. We have different types of white blood cells because we have to fight infections in different places. Actually, our most numerous white blood cells are neutrophils. They fall under the category of being a macrophage, or a small eater, basically, and along with eosinophils. The eosinophils are white blood cells that tend to build up in either parasitic infections or allergies. We see over to the extreme left, we see a monocyte that happens to turn into a cell called a macrophage when it comes across its enemy. The monocytes themselves tend to follow the neutrophils around, and when the neutrophils leave the capillaries to go to an infected area, the monocytes also leave. They actually differentiate into a macrophage, and we'll be talking a great deal about that next semester, so I'll just hit the highlights right now. Notice to the extreme right, we have something called a basophil. Basophil is kind of a cell that releases different chemical mediators such as histamines, and we actually have a tissue cell called a mast cell that we saw earlier in the areolar tissue, and these basically do the same thing, but a basophil is a true blood cell where a mast cell isn't. They release chemicals that kind of help the whole immunity process of attracting the white blood cells to the area or causing something called the inflammatory reaction. Now finally, last but not least, in the white blood cells, also called leukocytes, we see some cells called lymphocytes. And lymphocytes, basically, there are three types of cells that are called lymphocytes. There are B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells. The B cells and T cells perform a function we call specific defenses, and again, that's a whole subject in itself, and we'll be talking a lot about that next semester. Now, the last of the things on this picture are the platelets, also called thrombocytes. Really, platelets are probably a better description because they're not true cells. They're actually fragments of a cell called a megakaryocyte, and they're very important in the blood clotting process, along with some proteins and factors that are also in the matrix of the blood. Now, the matrix of the blood is the plasma, and it's made up of several different proteins, albumin being the largest amount of proteins that is responsible for osmotic pressure and some things we'll be talking about in the near future, but also the main part of the plasma which is actually the water, and that would be the ground substance of the plasma.
When I say next semester, I actually mean for you guys this semester. For those of you in my Bio 145 class.
Okay, now we have another connective tissue, which is cartilage. And we actually have three types of cartilage. In this picture, we see something that's called hyaline cartilage, also referred to as glassy cartilage. We can actually look and see the living cells being the chondrocytes. They actually live in a little space, or I like to call them little caves, called lacuna. And then the matrix here is mostly ground substance called chondroitin sulfate. And notice it's a prominent lack of protein fibers here. And that's where we get the term glassy cartilage. We tend to find these at the ends of our long bones and in certain portions of our body that need a good, flexible, but strong structure, such as our rings in our trachea, our larynx. Cartilage is made up of this, the lowest portion of our nose, the nasal septum. And at one time, all of our bones tended to, actually started out as this hyaline cartilage. Okay, the next type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. Again, we have our living cell, the chondrocytes, that live in a little space, or I like to call it cave, called lacuna. And but notice that our matrix is quite different. We see a lot of fibers, a lot of protein fibers in our matrix. In this case, they're elastic fibers, and that basically makes this type of cartilage very flexible. So we see this in places where we can distort it or change its shape and it flip back into shape. So for instance, the outer portion of your ear, called the pinna or auricle, you can bend it and it will pretty much flip back into shape. Another super important structure that's made of this is our epiglottis, this flap of tissue that covers our glottis, which is our air opening. So when we swallow, we don't get food or drink down in our air passageways, but it goes in our esophagus instead. And that's because we have this type of cartilage that's very flexible that can cover it every time we drink or eat something. Final piece of cartilage, or type of cartilage, is called fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage is this very thick cartilage. Notice we do still have chondrocytes and lacuna, but we have a lot less chondrocytes. We have collagen fibers in the matrix, so it makes this a very thick cartilage where the couple places we see this are discs that are between our vertebrae, called our intervertebral discs, which kind of serve as shock absorbers because this helps resist compression and keeps the bones from rubbing together. We also have this within our knee joints, our meniscus, and we also have it in what's called our pubic symphysis, where our pubis bones come together. So this is a very thick cartilage that, again, limits bone-to-bone contact and resists compression, serves kind of as a shock absorber. Okay, now our next tissue is bone, and of course bone has living cells in it called osteocytes, and we see a section of a bone here. We see that there are circular patterns in a certain portion of the bone that is actually called compact bone. We see several circular patterns that are called osteons. And these circular patterns, in the middle of them, have a space called a central canal that allows blood vessels to run through these because these are very vascular. Now, our living cells called osteocytes live in our little caves called lacuna, and then we actually have little cracks that run from the central canal to the lacuna with the living cells in it. These cracks, called canaliculi, do allow the contents of the blood to get to the living cell and the waste materials from this living cell to get back to the blood. Of course, all the material outside of the osteocyte itself is the matrix, and it is mostly made up of a ground substance, a salt that does not dissolve in water, and that's called calcium carbonate salt. Okay, our next major tissue is going to be our muscular tissue. And so our muscular tissue, we basically have three types of muscle tissue. We have smooth muscle, which we tend to find in internal things. We have skeletal muscle, which is the larger muscle that we tend to think of when we talk about muscle. And then we have cardiac muscle, which of course is what our heart is made of. And looking at our first type of skeletal muscle, when we get down to the individual cells, we see that the individual cells within this tissue are long cylinders that are striated with proteins that we'll be talking about, called actin and myosin, or thin and thick filaments that are in units called sarcomeres. Again, these are things we'll talk about later, but right now we can actually see the striations. We can see that one thing that's very unique about these cells is they are multinucleated. This is one of the characteristics that definitely makes them stand out from other types of cells. At one time, each nucleus represented an embryonic cell called a myoblast. But in development, these myoblasts started fusing together and then forming these long cylinders that became multinucleated. So, of course, our skeletal muscle is primarily what attaches to our bones to either move or to hold something in place. We also have these type of muscles in entrances and exits to different places. And of course, what muscle does for us is movement, and it also generates heat and even provides some protection for our internal organs. Okay, here we see cardiac muscle found, of course, in the heart. In cardiac muscle, the individual cells are branched. They have a single central nucleus. They are striated, and they are striated with the same type of proteins that we find in skeletal muscle. One thing that really separates these from the other muscles is we have areas where two individual cardiac muscles come together, and they're called intercalated discs. These intercalated discs are actually connection points, as we were saying, between two muscles that contain something called gap junctions, which actually allow ions to move from one cell to another. This becomes extremely important when we understand how the heart beats as a unit and how we pass signal from muscle to muscle, so we can have this coordinated contraction so the heart can actually do its job. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about these muscles is these are the only muscles that don't have to have direct neural stimulus in order to beat. We could actually take some of this cardiac muscle and stick it end to end in a petri dish and give it the necessary ions and give it the necessary nutrients, and it could actually beat on its own. But not saying that the heart doesn't have neural messages going to it. It does, but it actually has the ability to beat without them, because there's something called an intrinsic conducting system that helps pass ions from cell to cell. And again, we'll be looking at that next semester. But right now, we just need to be able to recognize this, and especially recognize these intercalated discs, and that are important to how these muscles actually function. Again, we find this only in the heart, but it gives the heart a specific ability to actually beat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whereas we don't necessarily have to have that same ability in our other types of muscles. Okay, finally we see smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is called smooth because we don't see the striations. We have kind of still a single nucleus. We have a spindle shape to it. These muscles are actually under involuntary or autonomic control, same as our heart. These tend to be located, these are located internally. Especially we see them in our blood vessels and in our digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive organs. And so what they're doing, they're usually moving some sort of structure from one part of an organ through an organ somewhere else. So for instance, in our digestive system, we go through a process called peristalsis, where we're squeezing the food through our alimentary canal or our whole digestive tract. Another real important thing that we talk a lot about is the fact that we can control the diameter of different structures, such as our blood vessels, by either relaxing